Hello my friend, here is a short video on existential freedom according to Jacques Lacan, a special request. Somewhat reluctantly, because Jacques Lacan was all too in evidence when I studied in France in the 70s and worked there in psychiatry and in psychotherapy, where everything, absolutely everything, was taken over by Lacanian interpretations of Freud. I found it very tiresome and sought to escape from it, so, warning, I am not a fan of Jacques Lacan. His view on existential freedom is also not that rich, but there are some things there which are similar to some of the ways in which Merleau-Ponty and Ricoeur went beyond Sartre and de Beauvoir as well. So for Lacan, existential freedom is actually a structural illusion. He didn't think that Sartre was right with his idea that human beings were fundamentally free and therefore empty. He thought this was a myth because the human subject, as he called it, is always decentered and enslaved to things that are beyond our control. So far, so good. In Lacan's world, we are not the master of our own houses. He describes human beings as guests in the house built by language and by the desires of others. He sees language as the determining cultural influence that molds and restricts any freedom we might have, and the presence of the other, especially the desire of the other, as a great limiting factor. So Lacan speaks of the way in which freedom is already restricted from a very early stage, which he calls the mirror stage, which is before we even have a self or have a firm grasp on who we are as a self. We see an image of ourselves in a mirror, and that mirror is very often not an actual physical mirror, but it is the gaze of our mother on us, and that mirror image looks much more stable and more concrete, more secure, if you like, than what we actually feel inside. So we identify with this mirror image and we take it on board. And this is why Lacan says our ego is alienated from the start. In a way, the ego is built on alienation. The I is built on the alienation of our selves being mirrored by the gaze of another. And this leads to, according to Lacan, when we think we are making any free choices, it's actually just the ego trying to maintain this fictionalized, stable image of itself. We are spoken by our self-image rather than speaking for ourselves. And in this, it is certain expressions and certain language that play a very important role in limiting us as well. Because, Lacan says, we are subjugated to what he calls the symbolic order. He argued that our unconscious, which he held up as a truth, that we have an unconscious, and that this unconscious is structured like a language. This is a structuralist theory rather than an existential theory. The unconscious is structured like a language. It has a grammar, it has a symbolic order. It regulates the structures of the world that we can conceive of. Now, this is quite insightful, and there are many others who have written about language in that way, of course. So the moment we enter the symbolic order, we enter into an acceptance of the world of laws, of language, of social norms, of everything that is being dictated to us by our culture, and therefore our freedom is even further curtailed. It is also curtailed by our sense that there is a big other with a capital O, a big other which is actually the collective network of social authority and language that dictates to us. We don't choose our own words, Lacan says, we inherit them. Well, this is of course true, but he makes no room whatsoever for us changing that when, as a trilingual person who speaks, 3 other languages beyond the 3 languages I'm fluent in, I cannot buy into this theory because I know full well that my way of being is not dictated by language. It is dictated by my understanding of the world, and that understanding is constantly growing and changing according to what I do with it and what lens I train on it. But anyway, I'm not going to argue with Lacan, I'm going to present him. So back to Lacan. So back to the chain of signifiers. Our desires, says Lacan, are not truly ours. They are shaped by the language available to us, and that's very narrow. So you cannot be free if the very tools you use to think, the words, are handed down to you by society. Well, maybe. So maybe we need to free ourselves from that language, and maybe we need to break through those barriers. But that is not so much what Lacan aims for. It's very much about power and about how we are oppressed by this power for Lacan. He spoke about our desire always being the desire of the other. This was one of the most famous things he ever said. We spend our lives trying to be what we think others want us to be. Simone de Beauvoir would say, yeah, this is how women are always othered by the male voice. But Lacan says we are all in that same boat, men or women. And really, this is Heidegger speaking. It is us imagining that there is a they, which is an anonymous they, which dictates to us how we should be. We experience an inherent inner emptiness. This, I think, is very much borrowed from Sartre. And we try to fill this inner lack. Sartre spoke about the lack with objects or achievements or various relationships, other things, but all these choices are dictated by what we think is most valuable in the eyes of the other. So again, we're not even free to organize our own desires or fill our own lack. We're in a loop. True existential freedom is nearly impossible here, because we are constantly performing for an invisible audience, the big other, seeking recognition that we can never fully attain. It is a tragic universe he created, and really, when he came up with the idea that the only radical alternative to this is called the Lacanian act, I gave up altogether. So the Lacanian act is the freedom that is available to you if you traverse the fantasy that you have inherited through your language and through the other, and to realize that the big other doesn't actually exist and has no power over you. This is the Lacanian act, because Lacan saw himself as the only person who was really capable of traversing the fantasy and taking charge of his own narrative in that way, as Ricoeur would say. So it is for most people too terrifying, he thought, to realize that the game is rigged and to choose to stop playing by the established rules. I always felt that Lacan was taking the mick and was seeing how far he could push his dominance over others, and I found this most unpleasant, and I never wished to be part of that, and of course was accused of wanting to castrate the master. So I don't want to castrate anybody. I want everybody to be free, to own their own lives. And from a Lacanian perspective, that is a very slim chance indeed. There you are. Don't like it very much at all.